Imagine waking up one morning to find half of your town gone. Not moved away, not missing, gone forever. Now stretch that nightmare across continents. Between 1347 and 1351, a single disease swept through Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, leaving behind a trail of devastation so massive that nearly half the world's population may have vanished in just 5 years. This was the Black Death, history's deadliest pandemic. It didn't just claim lives, it shattered empires, rewrote economies, and forced society into a new era. But how did something so small, carried by fleas on the backs of rats, bring entire civilizations to their knees? Origins of the plague. The story begins far from Europe, deep in Central Asia, near the Tian Shan Mountains. Here, a silent killer lurked in the form of a tiny bacterium known as Yersinia pestis. For centuries, it lived quietly inside fleas, which clung to the backs of black rats. On their own, they seemed harmless, but once trade routes connected distant corners of the world, the stage was set for disaster. Fleas carried the bacteria into human hosts, spreading quickly through bites. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Victims often showed no symptoms for several days. But then came the fevers, the chills, the vomiting, and the telltale swollen, blackened lumps around the groin, armpits, and neck. Death often followed soon after, with fatality rates reaching up to 90% in the worst cases. What made it even more terrifying was that nobody at the time understood what was happening. They couldn't see the fleas. They didn't realize the rats scurrying through ships and marketplaces were the true carriers. All they knew was that an invisible force was ripping through communities without mercy. The first pandemic, the Plague of Justinian. The plague's first major strike on history came in the 6th century during the reign of Emperor Justinian in the Byzantine Empire. At the time, Constantinople was the world's largest city, wealthy, powerful, and on the verge of reuniting the Roman world. Then, ships carrying grain from Egypt arrived, but hidden among the sacks of wheat were rats, and on those rats, fleas carrying death. The results were catastrophic. Within months, the plague tore through Constantinople, wiping out nearly 40% of the city's population. Even the emperor himself fell ill. Though he survived, across the eastern Mediterranean, an estimated 1 in 4 people died, and the death toll eventually reached around 50 million, about 13% of the entire world's population at the time. But the impact wasn't just measured in lives lost. Farms lay abandoned, tax revenues collapsed, and the empire's once ambitious conquests ground to a halt. With its population crippled, the Byzantine state entered a slow decline, opening the door for new powers like the Lombards and later the Arab Caliphate to rise. Dormancy and re-emergence. After centuries of silence, the plague seemed to vanish, almost like a nightmare the world had finally woken from. But the disease was never truly gone. It was simply waiting for the right moment to return. And when it did, it struck harder than ever before. By the 14th century, the plague re-emerged in China, devastating provinces like Hubei, where reports suggest up to 80% of the population perished. From there, it traveled along the Silk Road, hidden in the supply lines of armies and the caravans of merchants. Eventually, it reached the Mongol forces laying siege to the city of Kaffa in Crimea. In one of history's earliest recorded attempts at biological warfare, the Mongols began catapulting the corpses of plague victims over the city walls. The defenders soon fell ill, and desperate merchants fled by sea. But as their ships carried them toward Italy, they also carried something else: rats and fleas infected with the Black Death. Without realizing it, they were about to deliver Europe's greatest catastrophe, the Black Death in Europe. In 1347, the ships from Crimea docked in Sicily and Genoa, and with them came the beginning of Europe's darkest chapter. At first, the sickness seemed like an isolated outbreak, but the plague moved faster than anyone could comprehend, racing along trade routes and swallowing entire cities in weeks. Between 1347 and 1351, the death toll became unimaginable. Entire villages vanished. In Italy, France, and Spain, as much as 3/4 of the population was wiped out. England lost nearly 70% of its people. Norway, 60%. Paris and London both lost half of their residents. Florence was hit so hard it wouldn't recover its pre-plague population until the 1800s. Yet the devastation wasn't evenly spread. Poland, much of Hungary, and parts of Belgium escaped with barely a scratch, leaving historians to puzzle over why some regions were spared, while others were obliterated. By the end of those 5 years, 6 out of every 10 Europeans were dead. Streets were littered with abandoned bodies, cities, mass graves filled the countryside, and fear turned neighbors against each other. The Black Death wasn't just a disease, it was an apocalypse. The global toll. Europe wasn't alone in its suffering. The Black Death swept across the Middle East, killing 1 in every 3 people, and it didn't stop there. From Asia to North Africa, no region was safe. Within just 5 years, the plague may have claimed as many as 200 million lives. To grasp the scale, before the pandemic, the world's population stood at roughly 475 million. That means nearly 42% of all humanity was erased in less than a decade. Imagine a modern disease wiping out over 3 billion people today. It's the closest comparison we have to the horror of the 14th century. Entire cities fell silent. Trade networks collapsed. Families disappeared without a trace. The sheer magnitude of the loss reshaped the balance of power everywhere the plague touched. This wasn't just a health crisis. It was a global cataclysm that altered the course of civilization itself. Social and economic aftermath. Out of the horror came a strange twist of fate. With so many lives lost, fields lay empty, workshops stood abandoned, and nobles found themselves desperate for workers. For the first time, ordinary peasants held the upper hand. Labor was suddenly scarce, and those who survived demanded higher wages and greater freedom. Landowners, faced with no alternative, were forced to concede. The centuries-old system of serfdom began to unravel, and cracks appeared in the foundations of feudal society. The Black Death didn't just kill millions, it rewired the economy. Land values plummeted while wages soared. Opportunities that had once been unthinkable for common people suddenly opened. In this chaos, the seeds of a new system began to sprout. Early capitalism, the framework that would eventually reshape Europe and the modern world. Later plague outbreaks. Even after the Black Death burned through Europe, the plague never vanished completely. Instead, it resurfaced in waves, haunting generation after generation. In 1665, London was struck by a devastating outbreak that killed nearly 100,000 people in just 1 year. Decades later, in 1720, Marseille in France endured its own catastrophe, losing almost half its population. The last great resurgence came in the mid-19th century. This time the plague erupted in China's Yunnan province and spread quickly across the Qing Empire. From there it reached Hong Kong and then India through British trade routes. Over the following decades, this third great pandemic killed an estimated 12 million people, most of them in India and China. But by then, science was catching up. Researchers finally identified the bacterium responsible and discovered that rats and fleas were the true carriers. By the late 19th century, the arrival of antibiotics and new public health measures began to weaken the plague's stranglehold on humanity. The plague today. You might think the Black Death is a ghost of the past, a relic of medieval nightmares, but the truth is far stranger. It still exists today. Between 2010 and 2015, there were over 3,000 reported cases of plague worldwide, and in the United States alone, an average of 9 people still fall victim to it every year. The difference now is medicine. With antibiotics and modern health care, the plague is no longer the unstoppable killer it once was. Outbreaks are quickly contained, and survival rates are dramatically higher. Yet the very idea that the same disease which once erased nearly half of humanity still lingers in the corners of the world is chilling. It serves as a reminder, pandemics have always shaped human history, and while we may think we've conquered the old ones, nature always finds a way to surprise us. Conclusion: the Black Death was more than just a disease. It was a turning point in human history. In the 6th century, it crippled the Byzantine Empire. In the 14th century, it erased nearly half the world's population and tore apart the very fabric of society. And even centuries later, it still lingered, reminding humanity of its terrifying power. But out of the devastation came transformation. Serfdom crumbled, wages rose, and the seeds of capitalism began to take root. The plague didn't just end lives. It reshaped the way people lived, worked, and thought about the world. And here's the chilling truth. The bacterium that caused all of this never went extinct. It still exists today, hiding in small pockets around the globe. We may have antibiotics now, but the lesson of the Black Death remains the same. Pandemics are more than medical crises. They are forces that can collapse empires, ignite revolutions, and forever change the course of history. So when we look back on the Black Death, we aren't just looking at a tragedy. We're looking at the moment when death itself redrew the map of civilization. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate you spending your time with me me today. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more stories like this, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss when a new video drops. Your support means the world to me, and I can't wait to share even more amazing content with you. See you in the next one.